Hey everybody, my name is Ellery and I'm part of the students team here at Covenant. We are so glad that you decided to stop by our YouTube channel today. If you are new here, text the word new to the number on the screen and we would love to get to know you and send you a gift. And now let's jump into our teaching time. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's good to have you with us, whether you're joining us here on our Greenville campus or whether you are joining us wherever you may be online. So excited to have you in worship with us today. My name's Travis and I'm part of our team here. And I know you may have come for worship and a message, but I'm going to actually start today with a proposition. So, hey, added bonus for you. I'm curious to know that if I could pay you $5,000 every single year to move to another state, how many of you would be willing to take $5,000 extra every year? You can keep your job. You're just taking it on the road. Maybe, you're moving. Anybody willing to take $5,000 and do that every year? And not even the 12-year-olds in the room are willing to take that? Okay. Let me take another stab at this. How many of you would be willing to take $10,000 every single year just to move states? Yeah, okay, a few of you. All right, I see those hands. All right. Let's push it a little bit more. Now, if you said you're willing to cash out at 10, you're not eligible for this offer. If you're willing to take $25,000 every single year to move states, how many of you would take that? A few more hands. I'll tell you what, though, some of you people love Eastern North Carolina, maybe a little too much. My hunch is that some of you that cash out at $5,000 or $10,000 may go, hey, wait, that's not fair. If I had known you were going to offer 25, I would have held out. And my hunch is that if we had left today and I were cashing you out for what you said you would take, and listen, we're not, y'all. This is purely hypothetical. But if we were, that feeling of that's not fair would quickly turn to bitterness. When I was a young teenager, one of the things that I loved to do was I loved listening to music. Now, I came up in an age when there were two primary ways of listening to music. One was at home on your stereo system, and the other was in your vehicle, and most commonly, the radio. Now, I did grow up in the era when the Sony Walkman debuted, and so you could take music on the go, but let's be honest, those were cassette tapes, and when I was coming up, the new and better way to listening to music were CDs. Now, for the millennials and the Gen Z population, that was the way to listen to music. And so, of course, if you wanted to take music on the go, you had to have a portable CD player. And so, for this music-loving young teenager, that's exactly what I wanted. So when I was 13 years old for Christmas that year, I remember asking for a portable CD player. Didn't happen. Now, my birthday falls after Christmas, so I get a second swing at the piñata. And I'm asking for a portable CD player for my birthday. Didn't happen. And I remember asking my mom, I was like, why can't I have a portable CD player? Or when can I have a portable CD player? And she said, tell you what, you can have a portable CD player when you are 14 years old. Now, this probably resonates to a number of you who are waiting for your first phone or an iPhone. You, like me, have to resign yourself to this timeline that's being handed down to you. And wouldn't you know, when I turned 14 years old on my birthday, I unwrapped a Kenwood brand portable CD player with anti-skip resistance. And as a 14-year-old music-loving teen, I was living large for 6 months. 161 days to be exact. You see, I have a brother who's 2.5 years younger than me, and wouldn't you know that for his 12th birthday, he got this present, and when he unwrapped it, you probably know where I'm going with this. A portable CD player with anti-skip resistance. It's taken me nearly 25 years to be able to talk about it, and I'll tell you that on that day, the words that I offered to him were not happy birthday. They were, that's not fair. So this fall, I'm actually going to be launching an Older Siblings for Fairness support group. If you would like to join in, we can swap stories. It'll be a very cathartic time for all of us. But over the years, I've gained perspective And sometimes we gain perspective from stories of other people who have experienced greater challenges, more difficulties, or situations that are far more unjust. And there's a real life example from the Bible that really has given me perspective. I'll even say that it's given me instruction on situations in life that were truly unfair. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to catch up with the sibling rivalry between Jacob and Esau. And what we can take away from their story are profound truths that can change your heart, your life, and your faith. So if you're just joining us, or maybe you just appreciate a recap, we are in a teaching series called Getting to Israel. Now, this is not about how do we get to the place and the country that we know of Israel. This is getting to Israel being the personal journey of this guy named Jacob from a youthful trickster whose name is changed and he becomes the patriarch of the Judeo-Christian faith. Now, we've covered much of Jacob's story already, but in order to understand the gravity of the message and the truth behind it, let's look at the backstory of Jacob and his twin brother Esau. So Esau was baby A. Now, if you have multiples or you know someone who has multiples, you know then that baby A means that that's the first one that was delivered. Esau was the oldest. He was the first one out. And in that day and age, it guaranteed him the birthright and the blessing of the family. Jacob, as baby B, the second one born, spent his life doing more than just pester his brother. Jacob was conniving. Jacob was cunning. He was deceitful in order to take something that rightfully belonged to Esau. Well, one day, Esau had been away from their homestead. He was working. He overexerts himself, and he returns home to find Jacob cooking. And this is where we're going to pick up the story in Genesis chapter 25. It says that once when Jacob was boiling stew, Esau came in from the field hungry and said to his brother Jacob, "I'm starving. Let me devour some of this red stuff." Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright today." And Esau said, "Since I'm going to die anyway, what good is my birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Give me your word today." And he did. He sold his birthright to Jacob. So in a manner of speaking, Jacob conned Esau into selling him his birthright. But it didn't end there. Jacob then tricked his father Isaac into giving the family blessing to him. It's this whole story of duplicity of Rebekah, who is Jacob and Esau's mom, and goat hair and a blind dad. And Pastor Joe covered this story exceptionally well in the series in a message called I Kid You Not, so you can catch up on that. But essentially, Isaac was duped by Jacob into giving him the family blessing, the blessing that belonged to Esau. And when Isaac understands what has transpired and what has happened and how he was tricked, he has to tell his oldest son. And this is what happens in that encounter. When Esau heard his father's words, he let out a loud and bitter cry. "Oh, my father, what about me? Bless me too," he begged. But Isaac said, "Your brother was here and he tricked me. He has taken away your blessing." It says that Esau let out a bitter cry. You see, Jacob conned his brother out of his birthright. He tricked his dad into giving him the blessing. And this was everything to the eldest child. It was, in essence, the inheritance. It was the family legacy, all taken by his twin brother, which sounds really messed up to me. But maybe for some of you, you're thinking, that kind of sounds like my family. But we all can understand how and why Esau responds with this bitter cry, because what has happened is that's truly not fair. The reality is, we all face situations, relationships, and circumstances where we have a choice to make in terms of how we respond. And often we choose bitterness and resentment. Maybe you've grown resentful for something that you perceive to be an injustice. Somebody else gets credit for something that you did. Or maybe it's a coworker who gets a promotion that you felt like you deserved. Maybe you're bitter with someone in your life who hasn't treated you right, or they've done you wrong, or they've offended you. Maybe you've experienced bitterness because of rejection or failure, and that's the way that you naturally feel like you respond. Or maybe you've grown resentful toward God because you've just been dealt a bad hand. Health issues, catastrophes, things that are really outside of even your own control, and bad things that have happened. Maybe it's even the death of a spouse or a child. And listen, I may not know you, but I know this. Everyone knows that feeling, and many of us carry with us the bitterness that is rooted deep in our hearts and our souls. But there's a deep, significant, and spiritual truth that we have to understand about that response, the response of bitterness, and it's this. Bitterness disconnects us from other people, and it also alienates us from God. Now, let me just say, some of y'all are downplaying your feelings in this moment because you're thinking, hey, I don't have any bitterness in my heart. But maybe you'd use the word a grudge to describe how you feel, or maybe you just have some hard feelings towards somebody, and all of a sudden you need to, in this moment, you're going to recognize that all of these things are rooted in the same feeling of bitterness and resentment. But what we have to understand is that bitterness blinds us, not only to the goodness that exists in our own lives, but to the needs and the circumstances of other people. You see, at its core, a bitter response is a selfish response. When we think or we say, why me? Or, why not me? Or, why him? Or why her? Which is actually, why not me? It's a selfish response. And when we become so consumed by our bitter feelings, two things happen. One is that we completely overlook all of the goodness in our lives, all of the great things that we have going for us, all of the things that we might consider blessings. Because it's hard to see the good in life when you're focused on what's happened to you or what's been taken from you. But the second thing that happens when we're consumed by bitter feelings is that we grow disconnected from other people. It's impossible to connect and to care from others when you're working through resentment and hard feelings. And like it or not, if you're struggling with bitterness and resentment, no matter the facade that you may be putting on, people in your life know you're struggling with bitterness. They can point to things and go, I know why they're struggling. And what you need to understand is that the way that you present that bitterness, even when you think you're hiding it well, it makes it hard for the people around you to connect to you. And so in that way, bitterness disconnects us from other people. Esau responds to everything that Jacob did to him with a bitter cry. Now, admittedly, we don't know much else about Esau at this point. He kind of fades into the background while Jacob continues his personal journey to become a patriarch of our faith. But it's safe to assume that the bitter cry of Esau in that moment when he realizes what was taken from him, it leads into a season, a difficult and bitter season of life, trying to understand and make sense of what happened and why. Now, how can we make that assumption? We can make that assumption because his response and struggle is our response and struggle with bitterness. Bitterness disconnects us from others and alienates us from God. It could be that you've felt resentful of someone who's betrayed you. And listen, for some, it may not be what they did, but it's what they didn't do because they dropped you. They ghosted you. They wrote you off. They have totally not returned your calls and texts, and you're left wondering what happened. It may be that someone said something that felt critical or hurtful or mean-spirited, that it's completely tainted your view of them as a person. It may be that you're bitter over decisions that your parents made that have affected your life today. Those decisions may have been made years ago, but today you're still carrying around a sense of resentment. But whatever the case, bitterness chokes out the relationships that we have with others, and it alienates us from God. Let's talk about the God side of it for just a second, because this is a dynamic that we often overlook. You see, we have to understand that bitterness alienates us from God because it stands in opposition to three things: faith, hope, and love. Bitterness is the enemy of love, in that our bitterness towards other people makes us unforgiving and unwilling to love unconditionally. When we become wounded by the words and actions of other people, the natural response of resentment and bitterness toward the offender, it makes it impossible for us to love them. I mean, have you ever been able to really and truly love someone unconditionally when you harbor hard feelings about what they said or what they did to you or what's been given to them or taken from you? I think it's almost impossible. And in this way, bitterness ruins our relationships with parents, with in-laws, with our spouse, with our kids, with our siblings, with our friends, all the people in our life that we're supposed to love, because bitterness is the enemy of love. But bitterness also becomes the enemy of hope. Our bitterness keeps us living and tethered to the past because we only focus on the failure or the rejection or the envy or what we felt like was taken from us in the past and from past experiences. And so as a result, we are incapable of seeing a better future. That means that the hope and the optimism of the future is completely cut down. It's mowed down by bitterness and resentment in our hearts. And what develops for most of us is what psychologists call a confirmation bias, that we see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear in order to confirm what we already think, feel, and believe. Have you ever noticed that bitter people only see hopelessness and negativity? You know what I'm talking about. Whether they're talking about the world or politics or that person or the things that have happened to them at the supermarket or wherever. Bitter people only see hopelessness and negativity, and in that way, bitterness becomes the enemy of hope in our lives. But bitterness also becomes an enemy of faith. Our bitterness prevents us from trusting in anyone but ourselves. When we're bitter towards other people or God, here's what happens. We don't believe that anyone else is trustworthy. Why would I trust them? They hurt me, or I've been hurt in this same way, or this was taken from me. Why should I ever expect anything good's going to happen if I do it this way? We'd rather maintain control of everything in our lives. We want to manipulate every situation to the best of our abilities, or to ensure that things happen with our intended end in mind. And so bitterness thereby becomes the enemy of faith. So when we're so consumed by bitterness, we become alienated from God. He becomes like a stranger to us. And so we have to understand that bitterness disconnects us from others and alienates us from God. With everything that Jacob does to Esau, these twin brothers become disconnected. Now the reality is that Jacob flees and runs away because of what he's taken and what he's done. He's afraid of what his brother is going to do to him, and probably rightfully so. But Esau lives disconnected from Jacob as well. And it's not because there are miles between them and proximity where they live. No. It's because of the offense and the bitterness in his heart. Now listen to me. I've had a great life, but there are things in my life that I could choose to be bitter about. Things that were taken from me, that were given to others, or that I was deprived of. And I could choose to remain bitter about a portable CD player when I was 14 years old. But you would say, but that's ridiculous. That would be ridiculous, Travis. And yet you're holding on to something that trivial that is disconnecting you from people in your life and alienating you from God. Now, I know some of your stories, and some of you, I don't know your stories. And what you're bitter and resentful of isn't something trivial. It's something deep. There's a pain and a depth to it that I can't even understand. But you have to understand that it's keeping you from the fullness of God, what God has for your life, and it's impacting your relationships in ways that you probably have begun to overlook. So, let's get back. What happens to the relationship between Jacob and Esau? Well, years passed since Jacob manipulated and duped Esau out of his blessing and birthright. In fact, decades passed. Things begin to change in Jacob's heart. Maybe it was the fact that he was deceived by his uncle Laban, and that helps him to recognize the ways that he was deceitful, deceptive, and the sin that existed in his life and what he had done. But maybe it was just maturity and perspective that he gained over time. But Jacob experiences a change of heart. And God even prompts Jacob to do the hard thing and reconcile with Esau. Now listen to me. Nothing can or will change in Jacob's relationship with his brother unless he experiences a change of heart and mind. We don't know precisely when Jacob came to such a realization, but it was necessary for reconciliation to happen. And in the same way, you cannot reconcile a relationship in your life without understanding your role and your place in that. You can't reconcile a relationship until you yourself have experienced a change of heart and a change of mind. When God prompts Jacob to make amends, to make things right, Jacob knows nothing of Esau's life or his disposition. But he instigates this reunion. He sends a messenger to invite Esau to meet with him, to reunite with him. And his messenger returns that Esau is willing, but he's bringing 400 men with him. Jacob assumes that this is going to not be the encounter he was hoping for, but this is going to be a hostile encounter, a hostile reunion. And have you ever noticed how we always build up worst case scenarios in our mind in these kinds of situations? We always get thinking like, well, they're going to say this, and then I'm going to say that. And then they're probably going to say this back to me. And then I'm probably going to zing them with this. You know, we always build up this worst case scenario. And that's exactly what Jacob does. He's assuming that though he wants to reconcile, his brother may have other plans for this reunion. And really, can you blame Esau for wanting to have justice or vengeance or, to make things right or fair? So let's just push pause real quick on Jacob's story. Now, though Esau has kind of seemingly slipped into the background of things, Esau's story doesn't end with bitter, hard feelings. And listen, your story doesn't have to end that way either. You see, while the focus of Genesis continues to focus on Jacob's life, Esau continues to support his father's homestead. Esau gets married. Esau has a family. He grows in stature. But more importantly, Esau has experienced a change of heart and life also. Something that transforms his heart, his life, and his faith. So when they reunite, there's something unexpected about it. And this is how it goes in Genesis chapter 33. Jacob looked up and saw Esau approaching with 400 men. Jacob divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 women servants. And he put the servants and their children first, Leah and her children after them, and Rachel and Joseph last. He prioritizes them. And then it says, he himself went in front of all of them, and he bowed to the ground 7 times as he was approaching his brother. You see, what we see here about Jacob is that there's something different about Jacob. Jacob is genuinely repentant. This is evidence of a change in his heart and life. And so whatever your thoughts about Jacob up to this point, there's something that we have to take to heart. You are not defined by your greatest mistakes in life. Just go ahead and take that off. You are not defined by your failures or your shortcomings or your struggles or your sins. But here's the turn. Neither are others defined by theirs. And so Jacob, with this change of heart and life, he humbly submits himself, recognizing that his past actions have hurt Esau, and he's just wanting to make things right. Now, though Esau expressed bitterness and resentment toward Jacob when things were taken from him and before Jacob had run away, his response, Esau's response to his brother, is what makes the reunion unexpected. So here's how that goes. Esau ran to meet Jacob. He threw his arms around his neck. He kissed him, and they wept. Esau looked up and he saw the women and the children, and he said, "Who are these with you?" And Jacob said, "The children that God generously gave your servant." And Esau said, "Well, what's the meaning of this entire group of animals that I met?" And Jacob said, "To ask for my master's kindness." Jacob could have pummeled Esau, or Esau could have pummeled Jacob. He could have given him a wedgie, a noogie. He could have assaulted him. He could have done all the things that maybe a brother could have done as a result of what they've been through. But instead, he throws his arms around his neck. He kisses him, and they share a moment. And while Jacob can teach us that we're not defined by our greatest mistakes, Esau reveals to us that our perspective can change even when our circumstances don't. That we can change the way that we look at people and the way that we look at our lives, even when everything in our lives remain the same. You see, in this moment, Esau was still without his birthright and his blessing. He was still without the things that were taken from him. Nothing changed about his circumstances. And yet Esau was able to rise above, because it's all about perspective if you haven't figured that out. Esau realized that just as bitterness disconnects us from other people and alienates us from God, we can learn the spiritual truth that forgiveness restores relationships and reflects God's goodness. There's nothing that brings two people closer together than extending grace and forgiveness. Let me just speak to the young parents for a second. One of the most challenging aspects of parenthood is not potty training. All right? Well, one of the most challenging aspects of parenthood is not teaching your child manners or responsibility. Those are important things. One of the most challenging aspects of parenthood is not having to talk with your children about the birds and the bees. I would tell you that the most challenging aspect and yet the most valuable lesson of parenthood that you can impart into your children is the value and the power of forgiveness and asking for forgiveness. And you know this. You know that forgiveness has a healing component that restores relationships. You see, when we seek forgiveness, we think about it and we just go, well, I know I need to ask for forgiveness. I know what I need to do in order to make things right. And we overlook what actually happens in our heart, because there's a journey, there's a path, there's a process involved in that. And what we do when we seek forgiveness is we're intentionally making ourselves vulnerable. We are humbly admitting to someone else that we have messed up, that we have done something wrong, that we have disappointed others. Why? To demonstrate the importance of their relationship, to demonstrate the importance of their friendship, to demonstrate the importance of the marriage. And so that not only restores relationships, but that just builds character. Now, we may get to the point of seeking forgiveness, but sometimes we struggle with accepting forgiveness. You're able to go to somebody and say, hey, I did wrong. And I messed up. I screwed up and it was my fault and I'm sorry. And they say, I forgive you. And you wrestle with this like, no. Let me tell you, like, I'm really, really sorry. And they're like, no, I forgive you. And yet you can't let that be good enough. We operate with a mentality that we have to work for forgiveness, that there's something that we have to do to earn favor or to do something more to restore the relationship. And this is precisely what happens to Jacob at his reunion with his brother Esau. Esau forgives his brother, but Jacob says this, no. Please, do me the kindness of accepting my gift. Seeing your face is like seeing God's face, since you've accepted me so warmly. Take this present that I've brought, because God has been generous to me, and I have everything I need." So Jacob persuaded him, and Esau took it. Jacob felt like he had to earn his brother's forgiveness, so he offers animals and gifts and other things in order to make amends. It wasn't simply enough to be forgiven, and I think that there's a spiritual element here that we have to take hold of. That learning to receive forgiveness is as important as extending forgiveness to others. That learning to receive grace is as important as offering it to others. Grace is the unmerited love and favor. You can't earn it, you can't work for it, it's simply given. And we struggle to accept grace. We struggle to accept grace, and it's evident in the way that we don't know how to receive compliments or unexpected gifts. How many times have you ever responded with a compliment or an unexpected gift and you've said, "Oh, you shouldn't have, you didn't need to do that," or "I don't deserve this"? You know, these are all socially acceptable expressions, but they reveal a struggle to receive grace. Just like Jacob at the reunion. Forgiveness restores relationships and reflects God's goodness. You see, when we extend to others what they don't deserve, grace, we're reflecting God's goodness. Jacob says of Esau, "Seeing your face is like seeing God's face, since you've accepted me so warmly." So here's what I wonder. What are your actions, your attitude, or your outlook reflecting? Is it reflecting the goodness of God, or is it reflecting something else? Now, there are implications, we might call them takeaways or lessons from this unexpected reunion that can help us to reconcile relationships with people in our own lives. And so what I want to do is offer you three things, but I want to correct two major misconceptions as it relates to forgiveness. The first is understanding that forgiveness is not forgetting. This is one of those phrases that we say, think, or believe, but it's not biblical in nature. And the reunion of Jacob and Esau, it doesn't suggest it either. Jacob didn't just naively forget what he had taken from Esau in order to get to that place of being able to ask for forgiveness. And similarly, Esau didn't just, "Oh, I conveniently forgot what happened to you," in order to offer forgiveness at the reunion. I would actually submit that true forgiveness is taking the fullness of the offense. It's taking the fullness and the weight of the hurt and the pain and the anguish, but extending grace anyways. And if you're the offender who's seeking someone's forgiveness, forgetting would deprive you of knowing just what the other person is offering to you in that moment. So you don't have to forget an offense in order to forgive others. But a second implication of Jacob and Esau's reunion is understanding that forgiveness is not fairness. Confession, if you didn't pick up on this already, this is a hard one for me. And maybe it is for you too. But fairness is not a value in the kingdom of God. And it doesn't have to be a value in the way that you parent either. Each of our kids have different needs, and parenthood is not a one-size-fits-all. Just ask anyone who has a child who's struggling in school or in life. Sometimes kids need more attention, they need more resources, or they need more grace in order to achieve or to be successful. And the truth is, the same is true of us as children of God, that some of us just need more or require more grace than others. And at the core of forgiveness is a scandal. We would call it a scandal of grace, that we are extending to others what they in fact do not deserve. There's nothing fair about grace and forgiveness. There's nothing fair about the fact that Jacob stole what rightfully belonged and was meant for Esau. And in this story, there is no justice. There is no punishment of Jacob. There is nothing to make it right. There is only grace and forgiveness. But that's what's necessary in order to restore relationships and to reflect God's goodness. So, those are two implications of what forgiveness is not. So what is it really? I believe we've already implied it, but let's be explicit. Forgiveness is giving others what has been given to you. Forgiveness is giving to other people what's already been given to you by God. Esau recognized that God had blessed him immensely, even without the birthright and blessing. When we can stop and see the goodness of God in our lives, when we can realize that God has shown us grace that we don't deserve, then it makes it easier for us to forgive. It makes it a little bit easier and more natural for us to forgive others. And listen, I could have told you a number of stories today about my own struggle with bitterness or resentment. I know what I'm talking about is not easy. I don't mean to generalize it and make it sound like it's easier than what it is. I know that it's hard. It's hard to offer forgiveness to people. It's especially hard to forgive people who don't care or who aren't looking to make things right. A famous theologian once said of forgiveness that true forgiveness is forgiving the offender before they even recognize the offense. You see, forgiveness is giving others what has been given to you. God sent His Son Jesus to do something that we couldn't do for ourselves, to extend forgiveness to us for everything that we've done wrong in our lives, to atone for every misdeed. And like it or not, you and me, we're much more like the deceitful Jacob than what we'd care to admit. We live in resentment and envy of what other people have or that we believe we're deserving of. We make a mess of our relationships with other people, living disconnected from them and alienated from God. And yet, through the death and resurrection of Jesus, we're given something that we don't deserve. Paul frames it this way to Christians living in Ephesus and to us today. He writes, however, what he means by that is, hey, you may be living with a bitter heart. You may be living in resentment. You may want vengeance. You may want to have things made right. You may want something and thirst for justice. However, God is rich in mercy. He brought us to life with Christ while we were dead as a result of those things that we did wrong. He did this because of the great love that He has for us. You are, and for some of you, you can be saved by God's grace. The reality is that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is not fairness. Forgiveness is giving others what has been given to you. So, in this series, Getting to Israel, in the last part of our series, Jacob wrestled with God and he was given a new name, Israel. But before he could be called Israel, he had some work to do in his past. Just as Jacob was on this journey to become Israel, he had to make some changes in his heart and in his life in order to arrive. And similarly, there are things that you need to do. So, some relationships to reconcile, some grace to extend, and for some of you, some grace to receive before you can become the man or the woman that God has for you. So Jesus, we thank you for the grace that you have shown us. It's not something that we deserve or we could ever earn, but by your death, through your resurrection, we can be forgiven of all the things that we've done wrong. And we can experience a fullness in this life and in the life to come that was never available to us before. Today, would you just impart your grace to us and give us a heart able to receive so that we might be able to forgive ourselves so that we might be able to forgive others and let go of the bitterness and the resentment that we so naturally want to hold on to. Help us to see all the goodness in our lives and the things that you have given to us, and to focus on those instead of what we feel we deserved or what's been taken from us or given to someone else. Give us strength by your Spirit to reconcile relationships, just to take that one step, that first step to making things right, so that our lives might be changed, so that we might draw closer to you, and so that this world might be impacted by not just our forgiveness, but your forgiveness of us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.